The Ottoman Sultan at the time was Sultan Mehmed V. We have a picture of him, Sultan Mehmed V. And for quite a while, the Ottoman Sultans, for at least 100, 150 years, had become a mere figurehead. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed V, he ruled from 1909 to 1918. This is one of the last Ottoman Sultans, not the last. We're going to get to the last one as well. And the Ottoman Sultan at the beginning tried to be neutral. He said, I don't want to take either side. However, one of the sad facts of Islamic history, it's not just for the Ottomans, throughout Islamic history, many times the Sultan or the Khalifa was a figurehead. And there were people that were controlling the Islamic dynasty and the Islamic lands more than the Khalifa himself. And this was the case right now. When World War I began, there was a group of people that called themselves the Young Turks. This is another subject in history. The Young Turks. The Young Turks were a group of forward-thinking, very liberal, people that were controlling the palace. And the Ottoman Sultan, by and large, was a figurehead. And to add to this, the Ottoman Khilafah had become a very weak Khilafah. Europe had been mocking the Muslims for over 150 years by calling the Khalifa and by calling the Ottoman Empire. What was the title? Who can tell me? The sick man of Europe. This was the title of the Ottomans. Europe was the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans are the sick man of Europe because they are situated in Europe and they're the sick man, they're about to die. So the British had already predicted the death of the Ottoman Caliphate, and it would come now in World War I. Recently, right before World War I, the Ottomans had also lost a large chunk of their lands, the countries of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the countries of Albania. Additionally, colonialism was also very rampant at this time. The French were in Algeria, the Italians were in another place, the Germans were, England, of course, was in India. As you know, the British Raj was in power. So already large chunks of the Ummah had been cut off. But still, there was the bulk of the Ummah still under the Ottoman lands. Now, the Ottomans were technologically very backward. I gave a talk a year ago about the printing press to give you one example, right? That was just one example. Technologically, they had to rely on the West. Frankly, like every Muslim country in our times does as well. Where do they import the electronics from, the gadgets from? Where do they import engineers from? Where do they import major projects from? You cannot have any Muslim country in our times except that if there's a multinational project that needs to take place, they're going to send out bids to the rest of the world. They're going to come and bid on their local projects. As you know, right? This is the reality. Even much of the construction of Mecca and Medina is being done by German companies. If you don't know this, I'll tell you, right? So the fact of the matter is, technologically, no Muslim land can be completely cut off, especially in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. So the Ottomans are relying upon Western powers for everything. For a period of time in the 1800s, that Western power was England. In 1880, for reasons beyond the scope of our class, England cut off, said, we don't want anything to do with you. England cut off from the Ottomans. They said, get out of here, we want nothing to do with you. So the Ottomans turned to Germany, that was the second largest power. Just like in the 70s, for most of you know, there was England there was America and Russia. Well, in the 1890s, there was England and Germany. Okay, so the Ottomans then turned to Germany, and a very strong relationship began in the 1880s between Germany and the Ottomans, between the Qaisar of Germany. His title was Kaiser. That's the title of the German emperor. The Kaiser of Germany and the Khalifa in Istanbul. And this is best exemplified in that very romantic and famous train called the Orient Express, which even to this day brings a sense of nostalgia or a sense of, fame and whatnot. There was an Orient Express, which was the pinnacle of decadent luxury. You could board the train in Munich, Germany, and it would get you off in Istanbul. And as you know, the trains were the main highways and carriages at the time. So in 1889, you have this Orient Express, and you see many movies, even famous black and white movies and books and whatnot written about the Orient Express. What is the Orient Express? It's a direct train line from Germany to Turkey. What does that show you? Strong bonds between the two. Just one example of this. Also, the Kaiser had visited the Istanbul many times, and the Khalifa has also visited Germany. And there are, to this day, if you go to Istanbul, you will find monuments built for the various Kaisers that have come. monuments that show, oh, the Kaiser landed here, he was awarded this over here. So Germany and the Ottomans already have a strong relationship before World War I. And in fact, the field of Orientalism, which is the academic study of Islam, Orientalism is what you used to call non-Muslims who study Islam. Orientalism was strongest in Germany, and it began in Germany. I myself, when I was studying at Yale, the books you have to read when you start studying Orientalism are German books. That's why I had to learn German for reading. You have to study German. You cannot be a scholar of Islam in the Western sciences except by learning to read German. And the classics that were written in the 1890s to 1930s in Germany, in the German language. To this day, these are the classics. So Germany has the greatest relationship with Turkey at the time, and even though in 1914 the Sultan said he's going to remain neutral, circumstances changed, and it is said that the inner court, the Young Turks, maneuvered the Sultan, and the Grand Vizier, the Pasha, the Grand Vizier, his name was Said Pasha, is the title, Said Pasha, along with the Minister of War, and the Minister of War is probably the guiltiest culprit here. His name is Enver Pasha. So Said Pasha and Enver Pasha, they entered into a secret agreement with the Germans without the permission of the Sultan, without the permission of Sultan Mehmed V, and they formed what is called now an Ottoman-German alliance in August of 1914. Around 6 months before the war, after the war began. So the movers and shakers formed a treaty with the Kaiser, and eventually the Sultan had no choice but to publicly support this alliance. So in 1914, November, the Sultan Mehmed V, for the very last time in our history, issued a call for jihad. Literally, because the Khalifa has the right to call for jihad, as you know in Islamic law. The only person who has the right to call for offensive jihad is the Khalifa. So for the very last time, up until our times, in our history, in November 1914, Sultan Mehmed V proclaimed jihad against the Allied forces. And the Allied forces are, of course, England and Italy and France and Russia and America. So this is a public commitment, and therefore once the Ottomans have been dragged in, now the Allied forces can attack the Ottomans, fair and square. When you've declared jihad against us, obviously they're going to attack back. And the Ottomans, it was only a matter of time before the Ottomans would be invaded, and that is exactly what happened. A few months later, in April 1915, Britain and France launched a joint attack against the Ottomans with the express aim of conquering Istanbul. So for the first time, Western powers are attacking Ottoman lands, and this became known as the Gallipoli campaign. The Gallipoli campaign, and it was a brutal onslaught. And we have just a quick map over here. You can see it in front of you. If you look at the map in the middle, if you look at the map in the corner, you see Istanbul up there, right? And you see the Sea of Marmara as well. So they attacked in the Dardanelles Straits. So here is Istanbul, as you see, right? Now, Istanbul, of course, there's the Black Sea, and the Black Sea is connected, obviously, to the Russian Empire. So this is a direct passage to Russia, and they have to go through the Straits of Istanbul, through the Sea of Marmara, down the Dardanelles. This is called the Dardanelles, and this is a larger map of this small area. So the Allied forces wanted to attack this land over here so that they could control sea access to Russia. Because if you control, this is called the Dardanelles Straits, if you control the Dardanelles Straits, you control the navy of Russia. Is that clear? Right? If you control this small point of land here, this is Gallipoli. This is Gallipoli, and there's a famous movie in the 80s by, I forgot the very famous actor, very famous Hollywood actor. It's called Gallipoli, 1981, I think. It's a very famous Hollywood movie, and it talks about basically this invasion from their perspective. So they thought by control, and they were correct in this, by controlling these straits, they're basically going to control the Russian Navy. So they attack full scale Australia, New Zealand, England. They all attack the Strait of Dardanelles. And this attack proved to be a disaster for the Allied forces. They lost over 150,000 men. Now, it wasn't easy for the Ottomans. The Ottomans won. It was a resounding victory for the Muslims. And the Ottomans themselves, they lost probably close to 150,000 people as well. It was an 8-month battle, but the end result was victory for the Ottomans and the Allied forces could not take Gallipoli. To this day, the Turks take great pride in the success of repelling the British and French forces. It was also in this battle that a general shot up to fame and eventually became the founder of modern Turkey. His name was Mustafa Kemal, and eventually he was called Ataturk. It was this battle, the Battle of Gallipoli, that shot him to fame. It boosted his credentials. He was the commander and leader of the attack. You can call it the defense, not the attack. He was defending the Ottoman Empire, and because of the success of this battle, basically he could ride on that success all the way to becoming the president of Turkey, the first president, as we'll talk about in a while. Now, sadly, even though the Muslims did win the Battle of Gallipoli, that would basically be their only victory. That's the only victory that the Muslims had really in World War I. Elsewhere, the Allied forces prevailed. In 1915, the British invaded Iraq, and by March 1917, the Brits marched into the once grandiose capital of the Abbasids, Baghdad. Here we have a picture of the British troops entering Baghdad in March of 1917, and they took down the Ottoman flag and they raised in its place the British flag. And on another front, the famous General Allenby was appointed by the British Prime Minister and sent into Egypt, where General Allenby was told by the British Prime Minister, I want you to conquer Jerusalem by Christmas. I want you to conquer Jerusalem by Christmas. And Allenby changed the tactics of his predecessors. He radically altered troop morale for the better. He devised a number of tactics to help him in his quote-unquote crusade. And the most famous tactic of Allenby was a young, bright man by the name of T.E. Lawrence, also called Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia, he has a whole long story. We don't have time to get into all of that. But if you watch the movie of Lawrence of Arabia, which is a romanticized version of the events, Lawrence of Arabia is basically... you can call him a type of spy or a type of provocateur of the British. The British gave him £200,000 a month. In our times, that would be a fortune. Imagine in 1914. To do what? To use that money to persuade the Arabs to break away from the Ottomans and to fight the Ottomans. So it is as if they're being paid to cause a civil war. So the Arabs are now promised as well that you should fight against the Ottomans. And we'll get back to this point in a while. General Allenby launched a series of successful campaigns. Egypt was already pretty much under British control by the time. Before World War I, Egypt was already very much pro-British. So from Egypt, he launches into Gaza, into Jaffa, and there he fought the German and the Ottoman forces. Eventually, he reaches the holy city of Jerusalem, Baytul Maqdis, on the 9th of December 1917, giving the British Prime Minister his Christmas gift that he wanted, because he said, I went to Jerusalem before Christmas. And by October 1918, they conquer Damascus. By October 1918, they enter Syria and they conquer the capital of the once Umayyad Empire. It was only a matter of time now before the rest of the Muslim lands fall. And on November 13th, 1918, they invade Istanbul. French and British forces invade Istanbul, and Istanbul falls to the Allies. It is truly symbolic, in my humble opinion, that out of all of the magnificent and glorious capitals of the Muslim lands, Baghdad and Damascus and Istanbul, all of them, not symbolically, were literally conquered by the Allies. Literally, Western troops, Allenby and two of them, Allenby wasn't in Istanbul, but Western troops literally entered into Damascus and Baghdad and Istanbul, and then of course Jerusalem, the holiest of holy in that region. And there is no doubt in my mind that in terms of political humiliation, this was one of the lowest points in the entire history of the Ummah. Perhaps the only disaster politically that was bigger than this was the Mongols. Perhaps the only disaster that was perhaps more painful was the Mongols, and even that is, you can debate. But definitely, these two disasters, and I intend to give a lecture sometime about the Mongol invasion, but that's long ago. Many people no longer, care about this, even though that had its impact. But this disaster, wallahi, can you imagine? Every single capital of the Muslim lands physically captured by the Allies. And Jerusalem, the holiest of holy. It's only a matter of time before obviously the end is near, and the Allied forces eventually made similar conquests against Germany, and eventually Germany agrees to surrender.